Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce Anne. Anne Millbrooke is an aviation author and historian, and along with all of the research Anne does through the books and papers that she goes through, she also goes out and talks to the people that have those stories within them, people in the rest homes that haven't shared these stories in years. She goes to the spaces where the history actually happened. And as she's talking with us tonight, you'll hear her expertise in capturing and documenting history reflected in her stories. And so with that, Anne, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Can you put up the slides?
I will.
Okay. And meanwhile, hello everyone. I see some nice familiar names. I actually don't have a lot of my material with me, but I've got enough with me that I got a little ambitious on what I would cover today. From ballooning in 1885 through the return of civilian aviation after World War II. And if we could go to the next slide, we'll jump into aviation. A monster balloon was the first aircraft to fly in Montana. It was the Montgolfier brothers had invented aviation, the hot air balloon in France in 1783. It took 102 years for aircraft to actually reach Montana. And it came courtesy of the Montana boosters, bringing Professor Oscar of Cleveland to the territorial fair. I always slip into state fair, but in 1885, it's the territorial fair. Hunt had begun ballooning as a teenager. He had worked with some famous balloonists, including Wise, probably the best known American balloonist of the 19th century. Hunt was called professor, which was an honorific title given or taken rather by the aeronauts of the day. He brought a brand new balloon to Montana and he named it City of Helena. Whether that name stuck is questionable because I couldn't find it after his performances in Helena. But as long as he was in Helena, he named his balloon after Helena. Now, there had been balloons in Montana before 1885, but not manned aircraft. There had been party balloons, and there had even been some ascensions of balloons with no one on board, tethered ascensions at picnics outside of Bozeman. A group of boys in Miles City were having ascensions. Though they kept running out of money, actually they were running out of gas, and they'd have to raise money before they could have another series of ascensions. And they were using a gas balloon, and Miles City had to order the gas from out of town. They didn't have, the boys couldn't just go to the store or a gas station at that time. As I said, Hunt was from Cleveland. He was hired by the fair committee. Next slide. There was a photograph taken of him performing in Helena, a stereograph. The newspapers mentioned the stereograph, but didn't print it. And I have not been able to locate a copy. So whether or not it survives is unknown. But as this advertisement shows, Hunt was an acrobat as well as an aeronaut. And he performed 2 ascensions in Helena. It was a monster machine, as a reference to the size, which was 90 feet high by 136 feet in circumference. So 90 by 136 for your very first sight of an aircraft is a pretty good size. It was equipped with expensive instruments that could measure altitude, speed of ascent, and direction, but not speed of descent. That wasn't there yet. The Herald reported that the lightness of the atmosphere in the mountains meant that Hunt would not be trying for any record altitudes while he was here. His record is the first flight in Montana. And Hunt calculated how high he could go on any flight based on latitude, longitude, and his height above sea level. All factors pilots still check today. He had two ascensions scheduled on 2 days of the fair, so 4 total ascensions. And according to various reports, these were a great success, record attendance at the fair on those days, particularly noticeable record attendance by women and children. The Montana State Fair was best known for horse racing, and it attracted horse race fans and racing horses from throughout the Northwest. And in fact, when I was doing a search for early aviation, I couldn't use the term flying because flying was a reference to a racehorse. Racehorses fly around the track. And every time I did an online search by the word flying, I got all of these articles on racehorses. And in fact, some people in Helena and around Montana, it was in various newspapers, snidely suggested that the Montana Fair could be renamed the Montana Horse Races. But in 1885, Hunt and his balloon were the chief draws. But after 1885, alas, horses returned to center stage, and aviation doesn't return until 1910. So if we could have the next slide. And I apologize, I'm talking about 1910, the slide's 1911. But the first flight in Montana was in Billings. They brought in Ely, the pilot with the pusher Curtiss plane shown here, to Billings to the Good Roads Convention. And he made 2 attempts to fly. And on the second attempt, he got 10 feet off the ground for 2 blocks. Being a Good Roads Convention, he was using the road in Helena for takeoff and landing. The altitude and distance were determined by the altitude. And previous attempts to fly, there had been a couple planes brought in by train. This is an era when planes traveled by train. There had been a couple earlier attempts where they never even got off the ground. And if you think 10 feet and 2 blocks isn't a flight, please remember that just 7 years before, the Wright brothers first flew 12 seconds and 120 feet. And on their fourth flight of December 17th, 1903, they flew 59 seconds, not quite a full minute, and 852 feet. So 10 feet, 2 blocks. The newspapers reported the flights as unsuccessful, but it was the first flight in Montana. And Ely returned the next year and gave demonstration flights around Montana, which is how I have this photo. And if we go to the next slide, Ely in the air over Missoula, his pilot's license number was 17. They didn't, the pilot's licenses were issued by the Aero Club, the National Aero Club. There were no government licensing of planes. That was not enacted in law until 1927. And it still took well into the 30s before it was common in Montana for pilots to be licensed. But Ely had license 17. The first licenses, the first 5 had been issued in alphabetical order when the Aero Club began licensing. So the first went to Glenn Curtis, the second to Frank Lahm, who was the first Army certified pilot, the third to Louis Palin, a French pilot who flew exhibitions in Montana, not Montana, but in the States. And then 4 and 5 went to Orville and Wilbur Wright by alphabetical order. So 17 puts Ely right up there with the pioneers of flying. And he was one of the best known flyers in the country. He was employed by the Curtiss Airplane Company to make exhibition flights, which were a way, of course, of drumming up interest and customers for the airplanes. The Wright Airplane Company also had exhibition flyers going around the country, trying to drum up orders for airplanes. Ely is better known in Montana. He's the first one to fly. He's better known in aviation history as the first one to land an airplane on a ship equipped to grab the plane on landing. Like I said, he was here the summer of 1911, going from town to town by train and then giving his exhibitions. While giving an exhibition in Georgia in October of 1911, he crashed and died. That same summer, and I don't, like I said, I don't have my files with me, so I couldn't find a photo of Mars, but Bud Mars, also of the Curtiss Company, was flying exhibitions in Montana. And Mars had a contract with the Montana State Fair to perform at the state fair. His contract called for flights lasting a duration of 10 minutes and reaching an altitude of 50 feet above ground. And the flights were circular flights around the horse racing track. They were a big success. The previous year, President Taft had visited the state fair and was the big attendance draw. But in 1910, it was Bud Mars flying a Curtiss Pusher, like the one on the screen. And he actually flew up to 400 feet above the ground. And he made the first attempt to fly across the Continental Divide. Various land promoters in Montana had put up a $10,000 prize for the first flight over the Continental Divide. Ely gave it a try, but a downdraft forced his plane down in Magpie Gulch, short of the divide. So he did not win the prize. The Missoulian newspaper had an interesting comment on Ely's fair flights. It said, quote, "The crowd at the state fair takes more interest in the foreign airship than in domestic pumpkins." Next slide, please. The next attempt at the Continental Divide was at the 1911 World's Fair, not World's Fair, State Fair in Helena. And a young pilot, Cromwell Dixon, shown here in his pusher plane, actually flew the Continental Divide, flew from the Helena Fairgrounds 17 miles to Blossburg. He was guided by fires lit to show him where Mullen Pass was. He couldn't follow the railroad because already by 1911, pilots had learned that railroads go through tunnels and airplanes don't. He reached an altitude of 7,100 feet above sea level in this little Curtiss plane. Won the $10,000 prize. 2 days later, performing at a fair in Spokane, Washington, he crashed and died. I think you can already see a pattern of early aviation of crashing and dying. But let's go to the 1912 State Fair on the next slide. Obviously, that's not Helena and the State Fair, but that is the airplane of Tara Maroney, who flew at the 1912 State Fair. His pilot's license number, which he got in 1912, was 106. More people in the state are getting licenses. In Helena, he became the first pilot. His fair stunt, his big draw, was that he flew from the fairgrounds and circled the Capitol building. He's an example of an exhibition flyer that works fairs, but also hires to anyone who will hire him. And this photo shows him at Polson on Flathead Lake. The Chamber of Commerce hired him to give some flights that take off and land on water. So he took his pusher plane, took the wheels off, and put a single float on it. At the time, he held the endurance record in Montana for a flight that had lasted 43 minutes. He had raced and beat the Anaconda train. And by declaration of the state legislature, he was Montana's official aviator. He had actually been a traveling salesman. Before in Big Timber, he built his first plane, copying features from both the Wrights and Curtiss. And you will notice this is a Curtiss design, that it doesn't use wing warping. The flaps are not attached to the wings, they're between the wings. Not the flaps, the ailerons, excuse me. The ailerons, gee, I can't use my pointer. but they're between the two wings of the biplane. He performed over Polson Lake. He was paid a flat fee plus a percentage for all the tourists who paid to go on the excursion boat you see in the background. And the Flathead Courier reported this was the first flight ever made from water in the Northwest. And some of you may say, but what about Boeing? Well, believe it or not, Bill Boeing's first flight was as a passenger in a plane flown by Tara Maroney after he had left Montana. So this is the first float plane, seaplane flight in Montana. They called them hydro aeroplanes or hydroplanes. And Maroney was both mechanic and pilot. Next slide. Here's Maroney in the air over the lake with the tourist. And like I said, he got a percentage of every fee from those tourists. He gave several flights. On one of them, he took a woman up as a passenger, which of course inspired a lot of attention. But after his flights, he landed and he was in Polson on shore. Someone saw some smoke out on the lake and they thought a boat must be on fire. The gallant Maroney ran to his plane, hopped in to fly off and rescue whoever was on the boat. However, he ran out of fuel. He didn't do a pre-flight check. And he had to land on the lake and wait for a boat to come out and tow him to an island. And at that island, they found some boaters whose boat motor had conked out, and the fire had been a signal fire from the boaters. And so anyways, boats took them all to shore. And the local paper reported in detail on this first search and rescue by airplane attempt in Montana, and said the possibilities of using the aeroplane to rescue people from shipwrecks was demonstrated. And there was another thing demonstrated. The aeroplane will not run unless it has plenty of gasoline.
Oh, yeah.
What seems obvious to us today was learned lesson by lesson. Maroney actually went on and had a fairly decent aviation career until 1929, when he slipped while prop starting a plane. And the prop made a mess of his head, and he died. Next slide. Okay, this is again Maroney, the tourist boat, and other boats that came to watch his flights. And the next slide. Not all pilots were men in those days. This is Catherine Stinson, the fourth woman to get a pilot's license. Hers was number 149. She flew at the state fair in 1913, and her fair stunt was to carry the first airmail in Montana. She carried the airmail from the fairgrounds to the post office in downtown Helena, and she dropped the pouch of mail out of the airplane in front of the post office downtown. So first airmail in Montana was flown by a woman as a Fairstone. Now, I've mentioned their pilot license numbers, and you may be wondering, well, if pilot licenses weren't required, why were they getting pilot's licenses? And the answer is insurance. No fair, no convention, no chamber of commerce sponsoring a public event, no manufacturer exhibiting planes to drum up business could get a liability insurance unless the pilot had a license. And that is why the Aero Club of America stepped in and started issuing licenses so that these exhibitions and air races and manufacturers could have licensed pilots. That insurance was liability insurance. It did not cover the pilot or the plane. Some of the early plane owners insured their planes by getting fire insurance. After all, the planes were made of wood and glue. And only gradually did the insurance industry start issuing aviation insurance covering pilot and plane. But the exhibition flying not only prompted the need for a pilot's license because of insurance, the exhibition flying helped fund the pilots, the mechanics, and the airplane makers. Before World War I, exhibition flying was a chief source of income. Next slide, please. This is Frank Bell. I throw his picture in 1913. He was one of the first private pilots in Montana. He was a doctor in Billings. And you'll notice it is also a pusher plane. Next slide. World War I, I'll mention in brief, because it attracted a lot of young men into the air. The war started in Europe in 1914. U.S. did not enter the war till 1917, but many young men wanting to see action joined foreign forces. Richard Atwater of Helena joined the Canadian Royal Flying Corps. Lester Luke Brennan of Missoula, Edgar Bryce of Bude, Winthrop Brown of Glasgow, James Mallory of Bude, all enlisted and served in the British Royal Flying Corps. Edwin Schreiber of Anaconda joined the French Foreign Legion, the Lafayette Flying Corps, a French Foreign Legion unit filled with Americans. Wallace Kinsbury of Valère served in the Marine Aviation Force. Richard Saunders of Billings flew with the Army 9th Aerial Squadron under Eddie Rickenbach. And Saunders was killed in action in France. Next slide. All the US flight crews and mechanics trained at French bases. This is Alvord, one of the large ones in France, which trained British and American, as well as French pilots for combat. Benjamin Harwood of Brute was a Harvard-trained lawyer who went to France and trained as an aerial gunner and aerial observer. He went on to win the Distinguished Flying Cross. After the war, he served with the Division of Military Aeronautics in Washington, D.C. under General Billy Mitchell. And he actually drafted the first legislation towards getting an independent Air Force long before such legislation passed. Next slide. The pilots had no duties except to fly. And diary after diary mentions that. Austin Parker of Helena went to France to enlist in the Lafayette Flying Corps via the Panama Isthmus. The canal was not yet open. He went overland. A German in Panama didn't want him to reach the front. Someone says my lens is dirty. Wipe my lens. Hope that helped. He was captured by this German who didn't want him to get to Europe. He managed to escape, joined the French flying unit, and then transferred to the American forces when they reached France, but the Americans promptly signed him to serve with the Italian Air Force. But anyways, a lot of exposure and training in aviation reached Montana residents due to the war. Next slide. This is Charles Lindbergh in 1922 when he was a stunt flyer working at a gas station in Billings. Next. That's the Spirit of St. Louis in 1927 when Lindbergh is not working at a gas station, but is triumphantly going around the US on a tour after having made his famous flight across the Atlantic Ocean. Next. This is Steve Jeppesen of Dillon's and Oahu 9. There were no airlines in Montana in the 1920s, and Jeppesen set up one of the first charter companies. And 1927, okay, next slide. And because there were no airlines in Montana, in 1927, when Will Rogers came to Montana to perform in different cities, he hired Jeppesen to fly him from town to town. And Rogers later quipped that Montana had great, smooth aerial roads, but the crookedest railroads he had ever seen. Next slide. This is Billings Airport, 1928, and the tow system and the grass field, still biplanes, still, next slide. Part of what I'm doing is just showing you the transition from barnstorming after the war to more regularized flying. Shown here is the Bartlett Creek landing field in the Flathead National Forest. Next slide. And it's in the 30s that airlines and infrastructure, the development, the building of airports, the first paving of runways, the first airlines all come to Montana. These are Crow Indians greeting the arrival of Northwest Airways in 1933 in Billings. Next. Yellowstone Airport. This is the old airport where Yellowstone now holds its fur rendezvous. Rather bumpy landing, obviously, but the importance of getting tourists to the park, and more importantly, the importance of building anything that put people to work during the Great Depression. So the airport development and the airway development was federally funded as job relief programs. Next slide. There's an aerial view of the West Yellowstone field. Next slide.
And we had a request just to show that slide 22 again. So let me just.
Sure, back up. And if anyone wants any of these images, they can email me ann27m@yahoo.com. Okay. We're going to billing, slide 25. Work relief money. You're finally getting professional airports built in all the cities. This is Butte's Billings in development in 1937, and they celebrated a phase of construction in 1938. Next slide. By hosting an air show. And the buildings were also part of the work relief funding from the federal government. Next slide. Okay, next one. Okay, this is sands out of Havre, hunting and fur trade by airplane, back when extermination was the goal and furs were still. It's the Pacific Hide and Fur Depot is the wording on the truck, and Sands out of Havre is the pilot who supplemented his income in the fur trade. Next slide. Great Falls got the work relief money and built this administration building at Gore Field. Next slide. They built a new hangar building also. As of December 1938, courtesy of the various funding programs, Public Works, Civil Conservation Corps, Works Progress Administration, Montana had 82 airplanes and 1 glider, 74 airports and 82 airplanes. The construction was for jobs, not because there was a need yet. There were 114 airplanes registered in the state and 1 glider. There was 1 airline pilot living in the state, 34 commercial pilots, 6 limited commercial pilots, 55 private pilots, 3 amateur pilots, and 15 pilots qualified to solo. That's December 1938. Next slide. One of the big developments during the Great Depression was building the airway. We fly airways in the air, but you build them on the ground. And you'll notice crosses on this aeronautical map. Those are 4-way directional radios. Before omnidirectional radios, you had to find one of those 4 beams coming from a radio station with 5 antennas to send out the 4 beams to find out where you were, and you could follow the beam into major airports. And it's the beam that goes off into Canada that gave Montana the major advantage during World War II to become the base ferrying equipment to the Soviet Union. And yes, I can repeat my email. It's Anne, ANNE 27M, as in Millbrook, at yahoo.com. Next slide. During World War II, Montana did all kinds of military aviation, most famously building the Great Falls Air Base. They built it as a training base with satellite bases at Cut Bank, Glasgow, and Lewistown. They designated emergency fields. They created practice fields, all for training bomber crews. But the need to keep the Soviet Union in the war by keeping the Soviets supplied quickly converted the Montana mission to ferrying aircraft and other supplies to the Soviet Union via the Northwest Staging Route, an air route from Great Falls to Fairbanks, and the Alaska-Siberian air route flown by Soviet pilots from Fairbanks to Krasnoyarsk, where everything could be put on the railroad for shipping to Germany's Eastern Front, which the Allies wanted the Russians to keep the Germans busy over there. Next slide. To get some of the 8,000 planes that went to the Soviets via Great Falls and Fairbanks, they needed to get the airplanes to Great Falls. And they often used female pilots, WASPs. And I selected Hazel Lee, shown here, one of two Chinese American pilots in the WASP program. She was the 18th WASP to die. She died in Great Falls. She had been ferrying a P-63 King Cobra from the Bale factory in Niagara Falls. They had encountered bad weather and delays en route, the various pilots bringing in a squad of these planes. And finally, on Thanksgiving Day, 1944, she is cleared to land, and she is on final when a control tower realized that a separate controller had, by light signal, cleared a plane with a malfunctioning radio to land. There were two planes on final. They radioed her to pull up. She did. She pulled up and the other plane hit her. She lived for 2 days with severe burns and died. Because she was a WASP, she was not a military person. The other female pilots had to take up a collection to send her body home to Portland. Where the family was grieving because the same week her brother died in France. The family bought 2 lots in a Portland cemetery. Apparently it was all right to sell to an Asian, but they had to go to court because the cemetery would not allow an Asian to be buried in their cemetery. But eventually the brother and sister were both buried in Portland. Next slide. This is Hazel having her flight records checked. Next slide. Okay, Montana was bombed during World War II. About 250 of those bombs have been found. And they were launched by balloon from Japan, carried by the jet stream, which the Japanese were using long before American aviators started using the jet stream. And the balloons carried fire bombs intended to set off forest fires in hopes of diverting American personnel to fighting fires and in hopes of demoralizing the Americans. It was a last-ditch effort towards the end of the war, 1944-45. And next slide. It was a top secret program, totally kept out of the news, until this balloon was discovered outside of Kalispell in December 1944. Very quickly, well, the sheriff notified the military, which notified the sheriff to do a news blackout, but it was too late. A mail delivery person had already seen the balloon, and he was gone to deliver mail in Libby before the word that to put the blackout on. When he got to Libby, he told the Libby newspaper, which published the story, and that lifted the news blackout, and America found out that it was being bombed by the Japanese. Next slide. I was rushing because I really wanted to make sure I got this one in. This is a Cessna delivery truck in Helena in 1949. In 1941, the sale and even flying civilian airplanes after Pearl Harbor was ceased by government order. Bill Farmer of Helena had the Stinson contract in 1941. In 1945, after the war, he revives it and he gets some partners. They set up a Cessna dealership called Western Aviation Corp. They set up a parts division called Sky Supply. And they used the Helena Aeronautical School for their service center. And they sold airplanes, lots of them. In 1946, they sold 178 airplanes in Montana. 48 of them were 4-seat Stinsons, and 130 were the two-place Cessnas. The two-place Cessnas were intended as training planes, so they didn't have any frills. And under the category of frills, no frills meant no starter, no generator, and no flaps. A Farner and his partner, Charles McCharles, who I interviewed and who gave me these photos, they supplied dealers in Chinook, Glendive, Cutbank, Conrad, Glasgow, Bude, and Glendive. But in 1947, they promptly sold their businesses. The Cessna dealership went to Lynch Flying Service in Belgrade. The Stinson dealership went to Morrison Flying Service in Helena, and the independent parts business went to Bob Johnson in Missoula, and the service center remained at the Helena School of Aeronautics. And they got out just in time. There had been a big peak in the production of private aircraft in 1946, 35,000 planes built in the US. But by 1951, less than 2,500 planes were made in the US, private planes. So they took advantage of the boom and got out of the business. And it's at this low point, about 1950, that civil aeronautics starts using the term general aviation instead of civilian aviation for the non-airline, non-military flying. Next slide. And I'm almost done. I just want to show you some of the diversity of what came back after the war. And one of it was the agricultural flying. This is the Lynch Flying Service here. And there were, at that time, in 1948, there were 96 designated flying farmer fields in the state. That many farmers and ranchers had their own fields. Next slide. The farmers had to get creative. This is Tuck Barrett doing a parachute so he can supply the shepherds working his sheep in the Rocky Mountains, just west of Great Falls. Next slide. That's a package ready to be dropped to the shepherds. Next slide. The Bozeman Daily Chronicle delivered mail by airplane, and some of the residents in Spring Hill, north of Bozeman, claimed that the mailman in the plane could throw the paper out and hit their front porch. Kind of hard to believe since the delivery guy in the car can't do that, but anyways, they delivered planes, newspapers by plane. Next slide. Politicians started using the planes to campaign, statewide campaigns to get around quicker. Hoven lost in the primary, so you probably don't know him, but he ran in 1948. Next slide. And with the restoration of peace and stuff, you start getting some of the equipment designed for the military being transferred to civilian service. The new technologies. This is the first helicopter in Montana, purchased by Bob Johnson in Missoula. Next slide. And of course, airplanes cost money, so you raise money with airplanes. And the same is true with helicopters. And all of this, of course, began in 1885 at the Territorial Fair with a hot air balloon. Any questions?
Thank you, Anne. That was fantastic. Yeah, does anyone have any questions for Anne?
Well, I'd like to say thank you. That was very good. It's very interesting.
Well, thank you. I have many, many more stories. I do have a rough draft of a book. I just need to find 6 months to a year where I can be in seclusion, not pandemic imposed, to write it, to revise the draft and add. Since I did the rough draft, I have found some wonderful stories. Montana, Ulysses Grant in Boulder designed an airplane that was built by the Thomas brothers in New York, and demonstration flights in Washington, D.C. for the U.S. Navy, all brought to an abrupt end by the war in Europe. But an interesting aircraft with 4 propellers pointing downward. I've been out to Roundup, been to Circle, and find fascinating stories. I wish I could do biographies of all the interesting people I've chatted with.
Hey, Anne, there was a question in the chat of how did you get all of these stories? Did you live in Montana and fly in Montana?
I live in Montana. I'm just isolating out here in Western Washington. But I do live in Montana. I've traveled all over the state. I've gone to the National Archives in DC. I've followed up with some of the Idaho archives because airplanes don't observe state borders all that well. Part of the freedom of the air. And just gone around small towns, gone to libraries and archives. Like I said, I'm still looking for that 1885 photo of the balloon ascension in Helena. I know from the newspapers such a photo was taken, but so far all the archives I've checked with were pleased to learn that such a photo had been taken, and if I find it, would I please let them know?
Perfect. And let's see, someone here mentioned that that was Dick Logan towing the plane with his horse. So in that photo that you showed.
That's who the Billings Airport is named after, Mr. Logan.
That's right. I'm afraid my notes had tons more detail than I could squeeze into the time.
And could
Yeah.
you expound upon the emergency airstrips, the numerous strips that are in western Montana on into Idaho and Washington, such as Schaefer Meadows, Meadow Creek, and like I say, numerous. Do you have anything that you have in that regard?
Many of the emergency landing strips were built along the airway, the commercial airway that came through. You saw the aeronautical map of what it was like as we entered World War II. They were built along the airway, so any commercial airline could have emergency strips. But then a whole bunch were added when the military came in World War II, like the Dillon one, for the military pilots flying out of Ogden, Utah, up to Great Falls. They put in emergency strips. They had the satellite airports in Lewistown, Glasgow, and Cutbank, and they put in emergency strips because those satellites were for training air crew. And as a matter of fact, I didn't put in the slides. One air crew, a bomber crew training out of Spokane, made an emergency landing in Polson. And if you've seen the Polson airport, it's got water on 3 sides and a hill on the other side, and it's short. Well, this crew in a bomber got lost, got into bad weather, couldn't see anything, and were radioing, and the telephone operator picked up their signal, notified the people in Polson that there was a plane in distress. The people of Polson drove out to the airport, lined up their vehicles, and turned on their lights, and the bomber was able to land. They had to fly in an experienced crew for it to take off on such a short field, but they were able to land.
Do you know the year?
They were in, I think that was 43. But if you email me, I can check and let you know.
That's my home airport. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And there's all sorts of stories. Some of the farmer publications publish guidelines on what to do if a plane came down on your farm or ranch, and how to report it. For example, if it buzzed like a bee, it was a fighter. But if it lumbered in the air like an elephant, it was a bomber. So that when you'd phone in that there'd been an accident, you'd describe it correctly. So there were these fields put up all over, and then they had the practice fields, gunnery practice, aerial gunnery practice fields, and they always had to have emergency landings around them also. As a matter of fact, the P-63 that Hazel Lynn was flying to Great Falls was going to Russia. The US never used it in combat. Over 2,000 went to Russia. The King Cobra. The US used them in gunnery practice as a manned live target. And some of them, then they used dummy rounds to shoot it, of course. And after the war, some of those showed up on the air race circuits. But most of them went to Russia. But they did have these practice ranges. And so fields pop up, and you look at maps and the literature, and yet you go talk to someone and go, oh, there's another one.
And thanks, Anne. We had another question about, are your notes available to go with your PowerPoint?
Yeah. They
It's
contain,
recorded.
they're not a formal, but I'm happy to make them available. There's nothing secret about them.
Thank you, Anne. And just so everyone knows, this is being recorded and it will be posted on the MPA website. So if you'd like to view it again or like a copy, it'll be available.
Yeah. And if you like the notes, they do have more detail than I could squeeze in the time allotted.
And let's see, I have a question. Which website? The MPA website. So we'll send out a link once it's available. Once it's uploaded and available.
Christy, thank you. Thanks to Anne, of course, but thank you for helping out. That couldn't have been done with just one person. That was very, very well done.
Yes, thank you, Christy. It would be very hard to monitor chat and let people in the room and everything while also talking. So Christy let me focus on content. She did all the delivery. She gets all credit for that.
Well, you did the important work, Anne. So thank you, Anne. Anne has always been willing to come and talk to our group and share this history of Montana, which is just so fascinating to see and hear these stories. So so thank you, Anne, for always offering your time and sharing your work.
Well, I thank you, and you did very well, except when I speak to you in person, you always give me a drink at the end.
I do. I know. I'll have to.
but I anticipated that wouldn't happen today, so I have a beer chilling.
Okay, good. Well, I'm going to send you a gift card. It's on me.
Thank you. Okay. I'm actually doing an amber ale. But I see others got the same idea.
Perfect.
I love speaking to pilot groups. I have never spoken to any group of pilots that hasn't been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Anne. And we have a note here that I hope MPA sends out notification when your book is published. So please be sure to let me know and we can get the word out on your book. I know everyone on this call will want a copy. So
great.
All right, everyone. Well, thanks so much for calling in, and it was great to have you all here and see a few faces and lots of names, and just stay safe and healthy out there. And I know spring is coming. It was light out till 6 tonight, so that was pretty nice. So take care all, and we'll see y'all soon. Thank you, Anne. See you later.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Good night.
Night.